Thank you so much for those kind words and introduction, Dean Queenan. And I'd like to echo the welcome to everyone here in the audience and everyone here on Zoom. One of the only silver linings of the pandemic was the ability to have these kind of hybrid events and attract more people. So we actually have 95 people who registered for today, many of whom are in the room right now and many of whom are online. So welcome to Albany Law School, Professor. During these troubling times, it feels even more important to come together to learn about how we can make society a better place, a fairer place, an unbiased place. And I'm gonna be honored to tell you a little bit more about the legacy of Professor Katz. I did not make banana bread, but that sounds fun. Professor Katz was only the second female law professor at Albany Law School. Among Professor Katz's many crowning achievements was the development of the very first domestic violence seminar in the United States. And that was in 1986. Professor Lynch and I discovered that. And Kathy Katz was a pioneer. She was beloved for her dedication to helping others, especially her law students, frequently seen with lines of students out of her door. She was also respected for her important scholarship and admired for her innovative teaching. Professor Katz served as a mentor for so many other law professors, myself included, and she has been sorely missed by all of us. In addition to being a scholar, a teacher, a mentor, and a leader in the field, she was a proud mother and grandmother. Betsy, her daughter, who's sick today and is online, Betsy, hi, is here with us in spirit, even though not right now. And also Kathy Katz's son, Michael, and his wife and children all adored their mom and their grandma beyond words. And it's for all of these reasons that they decided to start the Katheryn D. Katz lecture series at Albany Law School. We are so grateful for their generosity and for the inspiration to make tonight possible. When I first inquired of Betsy Katz, what do you hope to achieve by commencing this lecture series? She said without hesitation, I just wanted my mother's name to live on forever. And so here we are. Let's give a huge round of applause to thank the Katz family formally. I have a few more thank yous. By that, I mean 25, so, who've also made this today possible. Of course, Sachi Vines, as well as others in IA headed by Jeff Shan, such as Lauren Monell, who's somewhere here, Megan Pearson, Alex Peebles, Marcus Abad, Tom Torello. Thank you all for everything. Special thanks to our wonderful law students from both the Family Law Society and the Women's Law Caucus, headed by Tara McCoy and Rebecca Bogat and Haley Marscatello, who have been really helpful from the start and also have been seating you and giving you programs. So thank you for that. I also want to thank our CAT selection committee, comprised of great faculty, staff, students, and alums, such as all the folks I just mentioned, including and also Professor Dodds, Professor Cheka, Dean Cruz, Kristen Davis, Ali Van Stackelberg, Gianna Santarelli, and our own Persia Wilkins, who I see in the audience today, sending a hug. Today is our 11th, oh, yeah. Let's clap for her. Today is our 11th lecture of the annual series, which commenced in 2015. I feel so fortunate to have been involved with this series in its amazing way to bring to the forefront the crucial issues that are facing our society today. If Kathy were with us today, and I feel she is in spirit, she would be troubled by the inequality in the way the law shapes and perpetuates it in intimate relationships. I think she would have loved this book and the fascinating research. Professor Katz is smiling down to see Angel Maldonado as our 11th keynote speaker. They share an interest in so many areas of law, as Professor Maldonado's scholarly work is at the intersection of family law, intimate relationships, children, racism, and inequality. And I'm so very delighted to introduce her to you tonight. She has been a friend and a colleague for over 25 years, although I might be wrong, it might be 23 years. And she might not know this, but she was my first non-clinical family law professor friend. And we met at a conference in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I guess it was the year 2001. I had the year wrong. Yeah, and I remember that conference well because they wouldn't give me caffeinated coffee. They only gave me decaf, and I was having a really hard time focusing. I'm very excited to hear you remember that too. We're like, please give me coffee. I'm very excited to hear her remarks. I'm honored to have read very early iterations of certain chapters, but I was very exciting to read the entire book cover to cover. The book is passionate, insightful, clear, and thought provoking. Many of you have ordered the book, and she'll be signing them later. Professor Maldonado is an author, a teacher, a scholar, and she also provides service in many ways, such as being a reporter for the ALI's Restatement of Children in the Law. Professor Maldonado currently teaches at Seton Hall Law, and I just love the synergies on the full circle moment here. Our own Professor Sarah Rogerson was her student in maybe Professor Maldonado's very first family law class. We're trying to figure that out. So Professor Rogerson wanted to give me some remarks to pass along today. And she said, I am thrilled to once again have an opportunity to learn from such a creative and inspiring expert in an area of the law that needs as many great minds focused on it as possible. With compassion, grace, and endless patience, Professor Maldonado opened our eyes to the power of law to shape or erode human relationships. I may not remember every one of my professors, but I will never forget her. So be prepared to be intrigued tonight. There are lots of interesting insights in the research. As Professor Maldonado notes at the very beginning of her chapter 3, Americans find themselves at a crossroads and grappling with competing values in that most people want to see racial equality, but most also fiercely value liberty and choice outside of government interference. So I look forward to hearing more, and I am delighted to turn over the mic to you now.
So, thank you all for being here. It's amazing. You know, you think you meet someone 23, 4, and here we are. Um, so thank you, Professor Brieger, for that wonderful introduction and for your engagement with my work throughout the years. And thank you to the sponsors of this lecture. I did not know Kathy Katz, but she sounds like an amazing human being. And you know, like her family, Betsy and other members of the family, to sponsor this lecture that focuses on the study of family law, gender, and inequality. And so I am so honored to have the opportunity to share my work with you today. Um, we all know how much work it takes to organize these types of events. And so in addition to Professor Brieger, I just want to thank Associate Dean Queenan for all of your efforts on this, for this lecture, and Sashi Vines, who I got so many emails from you. You made sure that I would be here. Alex Peebles, Megan Pearson, Lauren Minot, and Tom Torello. And then, of course, Dean Carlon, who I have not had the honor of meeting, but my thoughts are with her and her family. And of course, thanks to all of you for coming out tonight and engaging in this conversation, which I think is really important, and I hope you will do so as well. And I'm also very grateful for all of you who are actually on Zoom as well. So thank you. So it's simply not possible for me to really summarize an entire book in, I think, about 35 minutes or so. So that's not my goal. My goal for today, however, is to share with you why I decided to write this book, you know, what motivated me. I also want to share with you some of my, general research findings and also the challenges that I faced when I undertook this project. And then I want to share with you my goals. Like, what do I hope you as a reader and anyone who engages with this work will get out of it? And what type of conversations am I actually hoping to inspire as we all pursue the goal of equality in our society? So most of my writing over the last 20, 22 years has really focused on children's relationships with parental figures. As Professor Brieger pointed out, I'm one of the reporters of the American Law Institute's Children's Restatement of Children and the Law. And there we were really focused on parents' relationships with children and the state's sort of intervention in those cases. So I say that because I typically do not write about relationships between adults and generally have not written about sort of these intimate relationships. But about a decade ago, I noticed that many of my family members, about 50%, and many of my spouse's family members, he's here today, I noticed that they were in intimate relationships or married to married to people who were white. My husband and I are both Latino. And the reason that was odd to me is because none of us, none of these family members were actually in relationships with anyone who was African American. And I just thought that was really interesting because most of us had been raised, members of our families, in segregated neighborhoods, segregated schools. So that means that we were raised in Newark, New Jersey, or in the Bronx, or in inner cities, inner parts of New York City. And so we attended schools primarily with African Americans and Latinos and lived in segregated neighborhoods. We did not know really anyone who was white or very many people who were white other than our teachers. So it was really interesting that now when we were in intimate relationships, that so many of us were in intimate relationships with whites, but not with African Americans. And so I started casually asking, like family members at like barbecues and events, so, what attracted you to your partner? And then, it was really interesting to see how many were actually thinking about um, social mobility and sort of the use of intimate relationships as a vehicle for upward mobility, for racial mobility. I also asked a number of people. I mean, this was a while ago, so I asked a lot of them, and then did a blog post about this, about how they had answered the race question on the U.S. Census. And what was really fascinating to me is that although many of these family members kind of look like me in the sense of, no one's ever going to confuse me, think that I'm white. And so similar phenotype, similar hair, and similar skin tone, but a lot of them said that they identified on the census as white. And an even greater number had identified their children as white. And so to me, this was a little bit disturbing because it sort of suggested a type of racial passing, maybe a desire to be white, or at the very least, to distance themselves from African roots. But I understood it because Latinos are taught from an early age that light complexion and proximity to whiteness is actually preferable to darker complexion and proximity to darkness. So anti-Black bias is not actually rare in the Latino community. And here I want to plug Tanya Hernandez's book about, I'm blanking on the name, but looking at Latino anti-Black bias. And we are taught from an early age by our grandparents, family members, about the need to improve the race. It literally, I mean, the way the translation is, hay que mejorar la raza. You need to improve the race. And how do you improve the race? Well, by marrying someone who is lighter or someone who is white, or by having children with someone who is lighter or someone who is white. So my conversations with family members led me to conclude that some people had actually sort of internalized this idea that whiteness, proximity to whiteness was actually preferable. But maybe it was just our families that were just a little bit, I don't know, odd. So I really wanted to investigate what was going on. Like, were these racial preferences more universal than just something in our families? So I started looking at the work of social scientists and who were exploring individuals' racial preferences in the dating market, the online dating market. And the one thing I spend a lot of time in the book talking about is why do I focus, why are so many of these studies valuable when you look at online dating? And that is because researchers are able to look at not only what you say, but what people actually do, right? Because the two might be very, very different. And what I discovered from all these social scientists, and there's sort of a huge, just so many studies, is that racial preferences are very quite common. In short, I mean, I learned that it wasn't just Latinos, our family members who were preferring whites, but that Asian Americans also had preferences for whites, and also that even some African Americans, although not stated, their actions suggested that they also had preferences for white. So let me share some statistics with you. So studies have repeatedly found, like uniformly, tons of studies looking at, I mean, millions of people, by the way, online daters, they have found that most people on dating apps, regardless of their own race, are more likely to contact white daters and to respond to messages from white users. They are also least likely to contact or respond to messages from African American women and from Asian American men. So those are the two groups that are almost, we could say, sort of on the lower bottom of the racial hierarchy. It's very uncomfortable to talk about these issues in terms of, sort of who's at the top, who's at the bottom, these hierarchies, but that's precisely what we see. Now, we see these preferences not only in individuals seeking partners of a different race, but also individuals, also specifically among men seeking male partners. So men seeking men. And so researchers have found that the same hierarchy that exists in the heterosexual dating market also exists in the gay male dating market. So gay men of all races prefer whites and lighter complexioned Latinos to Asian Americans or African American partners. Now, women, it turns out, gay women, lesbian women, are actually the least likely to be influenced by racial preferences. But scholars have not been able to figure out why. But if you're, so heterosexual women have very strong racial preferences for whites, but gay women do not. They are the least likely to exclude a partner on the basis of race. So I've been talking about racial preferences on online dating sites, but these racial preferences are also reflected on the data on interracial marriage itself, right? So who do you marry? And so in 2019, 19% of new marriages, so 19% of people who got married that year were between persons of different races or between Latinos and non-Latinos. And I'm going to talk in a moment about why I'm talking about Latinos as if we were a race when the US Census tells us otherwise. But studies, now I said the 19% of new marriages were between persons of different races or between Latinos and non-Latinos. But studies have found that if individuals across the United States were randomly matched without regard to race, after taking into account, of course, geography, age, religion, socioeconomic status, education, all the other factors that we know really are sort of good, are relevant when people are choosing a partner. It turns out that approximately 44% of new marriages would be interracial. So the data on interracial marriage suggests that race is playing a role. And so we have those statistics along with evidence of people's racial preferences that really tell us that race continues to play a role. Now, I said I was going to tell you a little bit about sort of the terminology in a second. I think it's important to talk about, how I define certain key terms. One thing that you may have noticed is that I'm using the term Latino or Latinas, which is very gendered. And for me, that's a little bit problematic. So why am I not using the gender neutral Latinx or Latina or Hispanic? Now, although I personally would prefer to use a gender neutral terminology, turns out that the vast majority of Latinos are actually either unfamiliar with the term Latinx or Latina, or they just reject it. And so most Latinos prefer the term Latino or Hispanic. But although Hispanic it's a gender neutral term, it does not reflect our Latin American roots. And so for that reason, I prefer the term Latino, which actually honors, reflects our multiracial Latin American origins and identity. But I want to make clear that when I use the term Latino, I am using it in a gender neutral manner. And so it includes, male, female, and individuals who identify as non-binary. Second, I think it's important to explain why researchers treat intimate relationships between Latinos and non-Latinos in the same way as they treat intimate relationships between members of different racial groups, even though the U.S. Census and many scholars have explained that Latino is an ethnic identity. It is not a racial category. Latinos can be of any race. And so we know Latinos can, come in many different, look very different. So some Latinos are very light skinned, some are dark, some have very curly hair, some have straight hair. And so many of us, may trace our origins to multiple races, Black, Caucasian, Indigenous, Asian, for example. So, but although the US Census defines Latino as an ethnic category rather than a racial category, when social scientists and policymakers compare rates of marriage, poverty, fertility, housing patterns, wealth, education, they all treat Latinos as a racial group. And so for those reasons, social scientists, when they are looking at racial preferences, they're also treating Latinos as a racial group. Another reason is that it's important to honor how people identify themselves. And 40% of Latinos do not identify with any of the racial categories set forth by the US Census. So 40% of Latinos, when on the census, they are asked to check their race, and it says Latino, and the census says Latino is not a race. Latinos will still say other and write Latino as their race. And because 40% of Latinos do not identify with white, Black, Asian, Pacific Islander, or American Indian as the racial category that the census is imposing on us. The other reason that I think it's important to recognize why we're treating Latinos as a racial category is that Latinos have been historically racialized and continue to be racialized to this day. So, for example, Mexican Americans, which are the largest Latino group in the US, were for decades legally categorized as white. They were legally white as a result of a treaty between the US and Mexico. However, the US never actually treated Mexican Americans as white, and Mexican Americans were subject to Jim Crow. They were subjected to, at the most extreme, lynching in the same way as African Americans, but they were also, during the Jim Crow era in the South, they were denied access to schools with white children. This was actually like, in California, for example, in Texas, that Mexican Americans could not attend schools for white children. They were denied access to restaurants. They were denied access to public swimming pools. They were denied access to bathrooms that specifically were for whites. So in that sense, definitely Latinos were racialized as non-white. And then even today, Latinos are the targets of racially motivated slurs, discrimination, and violence. So for all these reasons, I think it's really important to recognize why the research treats Latinos as a racial group. Okay, so turning back to marriage rates, I said that the interracial marriage rate of 19%, as opposed to 44%, really, suggests that race continues to play a significant role when people are selecting their intimate partner. But the extent to which race affects our intimate choices really depends on the intersection of race and gender. So, for example, today, more than 1/3 of second generation Asian Americans and Latinos, meaning those who were born in the US, but whose parents were immigrants and came to the US. So more than 1/3 of second generation Asian Americans and Latinos marry a person of a different race, and that person is usually white. In contrast, only 18% of African Americans marry someone of a different race. But the contrast is even starker when one considers gender. And so Asian American women are more than 3 times as likely as African American women to marry someone of a different race. So here we see the intersection of gender and race. Now, we see the same patterns among same-sex couples. Specifically, we're talking about same-sex male couples. So same-sex couples are more likely than different sex couples to be in interracial relationships. So let me give you an example. So the US Census found that 28% of men in a same-sex marriage, 28%, had a partner of a different race, as opposed to 16% of men in a different, with a partner of a different sex. However, similar to their counterparts in different sex relationships, Asian Americans and Latinos in same-sex relationships are significantly more likely than African Americans to be in interracial relationships. So what we see here is, although the numbers may be a little bit different, and gay couples may be more likely to be in interracial relationships, the patterns are still the same in terms of sort of the racial hierarchy. Now, this is all really interesting from a sociological point of view, but I'm sure you're thinking, what does any of this have to do with law? Like, when do we get to the law stuff? Well, that's what I was really interested in, right? And so I was interested in exploring whether, and if so, how, the law has influenced and may continue to influence our racialized romantic preferences. And so specifically, I was interested in examining why some groups have much higher rates of interracial partnering, and how the law's explicitly discriminatory treatment of certain groups historically may have influenced our interracial intimate patterns, and how that history may have an effect on our choices today. And what I found was that the legacy of anti-miscegenation laws, maybe I should have put this up on I'll go through the list. Anti-miscegenation laws, discriminatory immigration and naturalization laws, segregation in housing and in schools. So those are sort of the historic, right? The historic, very explicit legal discrimination. But then in conjunction with current policies that we tend to think of as race neutral, but have clear racial effects, specifically exclusionary zoning, right? So single family zoning, which I will talk about, the K through 12 public school assignment system, which sends children to schools in their local neighborhoods, right? So local school rules, and then finally spatial segregation. So all of these work together to shape our romantic preferences. And I argue that they work together along with technology, which I will talk about in a second, to perpetuate inequality in our society. So let's start with state anti-miscegenation laws. Now, all of you are familiar with Loving versus Virginia, so you know that at some point, many states, or at the time that Loving was decided, 16 states still had laws prohibiting marriages, and in some states it was prohibiting sex between African Americans and whites. But you may not know or may have forgotten that 41 states, it was the vast majority of states in the country that at one point had anti-miscegenation laws. Now, you should be proud that New Jersey and New York were never one of those states. So, so I teach in New Jersey and we're here in New York, and I'm from New York originally. And so those were 2 states that did not have anti-miscegenation laws, but there was still a lot of stigma and a lot of, there were still many obstacles to interracial intimacy. But what's really, I think it's important to take away is that all of these 41 states prohibited relationships between whites and African Americans. A much smaller number, 15 states, also prohibited relationships between Asian Americans and whites, and only 7 states prohibited relationships between Native Americans and whites. So there you see this racial hierarchy, right? And so every anti-miscegenation law, every anti-miscegenation law prohibits African Americans and relationships with whites, but with other groups, they're treated, I don't want to say more favorably, but definitely treated differently. And then as to Latinos, remember that Latinos, because of this treaty with Mexico, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexican Americans were legally white, so none of these laws ever applied to Mexican Americans. But of course, law in the books and law in practice may be very, very different, right? And so marriage clerks throughout the country would still refuse to grant marriage licenses in some cases when Mexican Americans and whites were seeking to marry. Now, you're thinking, but Loving versus Virginia, that was 1967, right? That was a long, long time ago. What does that have to do with now? Well, as you recall, in 1967, the US Supreme Court held that anti-miscegenation laws promoted white supremacy and violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection and due process of law. But that was 1967, which is a long time ago. But let's not forget that for 300 years before that, right, the first anti-miscegenation law was actually enacted in the late 1600s. So that for 300 years, the law explicitly and also implicitly conveyed that the groups that whites were prohibited from marrying, that those groups were actually inferior to whites. And so generations of Americans have internalized that message. And when I teach Loving or when I teach gender in the law, I always get a couple of students who said, you know, I lived in New Jersey my whole life, or I lived in Florida, or I lived in California, and you know, it was just it was not explicit, but I always was sort of got the sense that I should not be having relationships with members of a particular race. And so we're talking about, you know, students telling me this in 2019, 2020, 2022, so that their families have internalized that message and it's passed on implicitly to them. So I talked about state anti-miscegenation laws, but what about federal law? So federal laws conveyed a similar message of white supremacy. So beginning in 1882, Congress passed numerous laws banning persons from Asia and from Latin America from immigrating to the United States. For example, just to give you one act, the Immigration Act of 1924 excluded any person ineligible for citizenship from entry into the United States. At the time, only whites and persons of African ancestry as a result of the 14th Amendment were eligible to become US citizens. Moreover, in the 2 years prior to the 1924 Immigration Act, the Supreme Court, in 2 decisions, Ozawa versus the US and Singh versus the United States, the Supreme Court had held that Asian Americans were not white. And so now that meant that as a result of those 2 decisions and the Immigration Act of 1924, virtually all individuals of Asian ancestry were barred from entry into the United States. And another federal law provided that American women who married Asian American men or married any man who was ineligible for citizenship, they forfeited their own US citizenship. Again, the intersection of gender, right? So how it's only women who would forfeit their US citizenship. But because the men who were ineligible for citizenship were all Asian, then that meant that we now see, you know, the disparity in part between sort of, you know, the gender disparity in terms of interracial marriage rates of Asian American women with whites and Asian American men marrying whites. So we see that although federal law never expressly, you know, prohibited marriages on the basis of race, the effect was very much the same. So what about Latinos? Remember how I said, because of this treaty with Mexico, Mexican Americans were legally white. And so you would think, well, the federal government isn't trying to keep Latinos, isn't trying to prohibit relationships between Latinos and whites. Well, the federal government could not enact immigration laws, specifically prohibiting, like treating Latinos as sort of a racial group because Mexican Americans were considered white. But just a couple of months after the 1924 Immigration Act, which barred Asians from entering the United States, Congress created the Border Patrol. And to specifically exclude immigrants from Mexico. I mean, it was very clear, the legislative history. And then a few years later, Congress passed the, quote, Undesirable Aliens Act, which prohibited entry into the US outside an official port of entry, and which made it a felony to enter the US illegally after being deported. Now, the Undesirable Aliens Act, I think the language says it all, was driven by, quote, I'm reading here from the legislative history, a fear of race mixture between white women and inferior races. That's in the legislative history. And the act is actually replete with language, more language demonstrating that lawmakers believed that the US had to restrict immigration from Latin America because, and here's a quote again, blood from a person from Latin America is a very great penalty upon the society which assimilates it because it is composed of mixture blood of white, Indian, and Negro. Highly offensive language. And a federal court in 2011 said that the Undesirable Alien Act solidified the perception of persons from Latin America as a separate, unwelcome race. And that is despite the fact that persons from Mexico were legally white. And so why do I spend so much time on this? To show you how the law, federal law and state law, shaped race and our preferences and who was an appropriate intimate partner. Okay, let's move to segregation in housing and schools. So until the late 1960s, federal, state, and local governments promoted and enforced discriminatory housing policies such as redlining and racially restrictive covenants and like all these policies that you were familiar with. And these policies kept African Americans and also Latinos and other racial minorities, and also some religious minorities, for example, like Jews, out of white neighborhoods and schools with predominantly white students. This is all documented in Richard Rothstein's amazing book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, which I highly recommend. So I'm not gonna go into it here, but what's important for my purposes is that preventing interracial intimacy was a driving force behind segregation. When we think about housing segregation and educational segregation, we're not thinking about interracial intimacy, but in fact, lawmakers expressly defended residential segregation on this ground, meaning like they needed to prevent interracial intimacy. Lawmakers feared that if white children and non-white children went to school together and they lived near each other, they went to school together, they shared public spaces, that they would actually become friends. And that would eventually, develop possibly into interracial intimacy. Maybe they would date, get married, have children. The idea of mixed race children was very scary to lawmakers. So what's I think really important to also take away is that although when we think about sort of Jim Crow, we think about residential segregation, we think about educational segregation, we're often focused on the South, but we shouldn't. Because states across the US, including New York here, California, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Boston, sort of known, there's a lot has been written about Boston. All of these states or cities assigned African-American, Indian, American Indian, Asian, and Latino children to schools without white children. And so the lawmakers agreed with parents, right? So there were a lot of parents who were lobbying lawmakers and were saying, if our white children go to school with children of color, then it means that it may lead to, the term that they used was amalgamation. And so here I just want to read to you, tell you a little bit about this Mississippi Supreme Court case. And this was a 1925 decision in the case of Rice versus Gong, which really illustrates, sort of the fear that integrated schools would lead to interracial intimacy. And that is why we had to maintain segregated schools. So in this case, you have a 9-year-old girl of Chinese descent who her parents wanted to send her to the school that was like a block from their house. But she was denied access to that local school because she was of Chinese descent, and that was a school for white children. So her father, brought an action, arguing that it violated, that this, the rule violated her right, his daughter's right to equal treatment under the U.S. Constitution, violates the Equal Protection Clause. The Mississippi Supreme Court disagreed. The court said it looked at its constitution, and the Mississippi Constitution required separate schools for white and colored, this is, again, the language in the Constitution, and colored students. And also the Constitution prohibited marriages between whites and members of the, I apologize for the language, I'm just trying to be very true to the language in the Constitution of Mississippi, Mongolian race. And the Mississippi Supreme Court concluded that the purpose of both provisions in the Constitution, one, requiring, segregated schools, and two, prohibiting marriages between whites and persons of Asian descent, was to, quote, preserve the integrity and purity of the white race, and held that, again, another quote, taking all of the provisions of the law together, it is manifest that it is the policy of this state to maintain separate schools and other places of association for the races so as to prevent race amalgamation. So all historic, but it gives you a sense of, again, the role of law in shaping our preferences. So I've been talking about the past. Now I want to talk about current policies that perpetuate physical and psychological distance between racial groups and which limit opportunities for interracial relationships. But I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that the past maybe isn't totally in the past. So when we think about school segregation, the reality is that despite Brown versus the Board of Education, not that much has changed. Our schools today are just as or even more segregated than our schools were in the 1970s. And New York, New Jersey, California, all have the honor of having the most segregated schools in the country. We're in the top 7 for the states with the most segregated schools. So not that much has changed. Our children still go to school. White children still tend to go to school with white children. African American and Latino children tend to go to school with African American and Latino children. So the past isn't actually the past. But these segregated schools and these segregated neighborhoods are facilitated. They are made possible by exclusionary zoning. And those of you who are property scholars or care a lot about zoning, probably thought about, what are so many of the reasons why single family zoning may be problematic in the sense, because it keeps racial minorities out of predominantly white suburbs. And so it limits opportunities for, accumulation of wealth. It limits access to better schools. It limits access to resources, but it also limits opportunities for interracial interactions between children of different racial backgrounds. Another policy for those property people that serves to keep racial minorities out of predominantly white neighborhoods is the Mrs. Murphy exception. Now, if you took property recently, you're like, I forgot what that is. So as all of you know, the federal law and in most states, also state law, prohibits property owners from discriminating when they're actually seeking a tenant. But there's an exception for property owners of, who are of units under federal law for an owner of a multifamily dwelling of 4 or fewer units in which the owner, the landlord, is actually going to occupy it. In those cases, the property owner can discriminate on the basis of race or on the basis of, virtually anything, right? They can exclude tenants on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation. And The problem with the Mrs. Murphy exception, of course, is number one, it keeps people of certain races out, keeps them out of housing, and we have a housing shortage, so that's really problematic. But it also serves to signal that property owners should not have to live in close proximity to people that they find distasteful for whatever reason. Um, and actually, part of the legislative history for the Federal Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination, talks about just how stigmatizing and how harmful it can be to be discriminated against in the housing context because of your race. Yet we allow it in certain scenarios, right? The Mrs. Murphy exception. I said I was also going to talk about the K through 12 public school assignment system. And so about 75% of children in the US who go to public schools go to their local school. But because our neighborhoods are segregated, the local school is necessarily going to be segregated as well. And so that means that our K through 12 public school assignment system perpetuates the segregation that we see that we have long seen in our schools. But it not only perpetuates segregation, it also perpetuates the achievement gap. And because these schools, so for example, the schools in predominantly white neighborhoods tend to have more resources. And the schools in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods tend to be high poverty schools, have lower resources, which means that they're going to be lower performing. Now, if we perpetuate this achievement gap, what does that mean for access to higher education, access to careers? And it creates the racial stratification that we see in our workplaces as well, where we may have a diverse workplace, but the people who are making the decisions are of one race, and the people who are not making those decisions are of different races. The K through 12 school assignment system also creates psychological distance between groups, because one of the things that you may be thinking about is, okay, well, but all of this ends once you go to college, right? Because colleges are more diverse sometimes than the schools we attended to when we were in K through 12. But the problem is that if most of your life you have gone to school with children of a particular race, by the time you get to college, it's difficult, it is awkward, a lot of times to make friends, deep friendships across these lines. And so when students get to college and they meet other students of other racial backgrounds, they actually report feeling very awkward and very anxious around them. And this is known as racial anxiety. And it hinders the development of interracial relationships and romantic relationships. Okay, so moving along. I'm okay? All right. Okay, so I want to talk about spatial segregation, and then I'll talk about online dating and then some solutions. So spatial segregation is another it's another way that the law has perpetuated segregation and limits opportunities for interracial intimacy. So the places where people eat, where you go out to eat, where you shop, where you exercise, they often have racial identity. And when racial minorities try to enter what are very clearly white spaces, they are often told that they don't belong. And so both in explicit and implicit ways. So think about, we've all heard people who are penalized for driving, walking, jogging while Black or brown. Think Trayvon Martin or Ahmaud Arbery, or a study that was done by my colleagues at Seton Hall of police stops in Bloomfield, New Jersey. And what they found is that racial minorities who were driving through, some white suburbs or white areas are disproportionately stopped by the police. And there's studies like this all across the country. I just mentioned that one because it was done by my colleagues and some of my students. But it's not just harassment by the police that leads to this spatial and segregation, but it's also that the law has failed and at times refused to make certain areas accessible to racial minorities who are more likely to rely on public transportation and less likely to have cars that will allow them to enter certain spaces. So lawmakers have actually rejected proposals to expand public transportation that would allow racial minorities to enter these neighborhoods. And so constituents in wealthy areas in Atlanta, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., for example, have opposed placing transit stops in their neighborhoods, even though doesn't it benefit everyone in the neighborhood if you have a transit stop? Well, they've opposed them because it would allow for low-income racial minorities to access those neighborhoods. And so lawmakers have tried to satisfy their constituents, even though it may be to the detriment of some people in those communities. And so spatial segregation and the policing of white spaces limit opportunities for people of different races to come together, right? It limits the opportunities for people to like meet at the gym, at a park, and just sort of interact. It creates physical barriers and it creates psychological distance. So I've been talking a lot about how the law hinders opportunities for people to meet offline, to meet in the real world, right? But the reality is that in this day and age, 75% of us are meeting our partners online. So you may be thinking, so how is any of this relevant? Well, it's very relevant because our limited opportunities to meet people of different races offline influences who we are interested in meeting online, right? The internet doesn't have any geographical boundaries, but the psychological boundaries that we have, that we were sort of raised with and that, we carry in the real world, they follow us onto the internet. And so the people that we tend to see as appropriate partners sort of in the real world are the same people that we tend to seek and to be open to dating when we go online. Remember what we said, every study, these are like studies that have looked at millions of people on dating apps like Match and Hinge, et cetera. They have found that individuals do not seek or respond to messages from people that they have been brought to, they have been raised to see as inappropriate partners. Now, as I said, people on dating apps are least likely to contact African-American women and Asian-American men. And you may think, okay, but people go onto dating apps and they get to pick whatever they like. Like, what does that have to do with anything? Like, why should dating apps be responsible? But dating apps are not like mere receptacles for our racial preferences, but they have actually helped to shape our preferences. Dating platforms have facilitated racial discrimination by designing their apps with race and ethnicity filters. And so until recently, some of the most popular apps, including OkCupid, Match, Hinge, Grindr, just the vast majority of them, they had filters that allowed users to categorically exclude members of certain races. Like you have a drop-down menu, which races do you not want to see? Now, many of these apps did remove these filters post-2020, after the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning that began in 2020, and we can discuss whether that's still going on or whether things have changed. But that racial reckoning that was triggered by the murder of George Floyd led many of these apps to eliminate their race filters. Other apps, however, Hinge and Match, have not removed them, so you can still categorically exclude people of different races from sort of the view. Like you never have to see them; they don't exist. But now you may be thinking, okay, well, like just choose an app. We can choose an app that doesn't have those filters. But even without those filters, the algorithms on these dating apps, and I don't know anything about algorithms, and most of us, they're trade secrets. We're not going to know. But these algorithms on the dating apps are such that they're only going to show you people that the algorithm believes you're going to be interested in. So if you've been swiping right, meaning yes, on white daters, and you've been swiping left on Asian American daters, for example, meaning no, then the app is only going to show you white daters. And there is actually, some people have actually complained that they are, that they're on these dating apps and they're being shown sort of the same people of a particular race only. And they're saying, no, I want to see everyone. But the app is saying, well, we think people like you would really only prefer to see people of this particular race. So even when individuals are interested in considering people of other races, the apps themselves, the algorithms, are making it very difficult for that to happen. So dating apps not only facilitate discrimination, but they signal that racism is acceptable and even desirable. So how do racial preferences, which many of us will think, well, it's personal, right? Attraction is very personal. How does that perpetuate inequality in our society? Well, I acknowledge that attraction is very complicated. And people have all types of preferences when they're choosing a partner, right? Height, education, religion, exercise enthusiast, movie lover. I mean, whatever, take your pick. So you might ask, well, why is race any different? Race is different because the law, number one, really played a big role in shaping our preferences. But race is different because our intimate preferences collectively reinforce racial hierarchy and inequality in our society. One of the things that I hate to acknowledge, and people tell me I'm very naive about this, but one of the things that everyone, like all sociologists agree upon, is that long-term romantic partnerships provide many benefits, psychological benefits, but also financial benefits, social benefits, reputational benefits. And racial preferences limit a person's opportunities for romantic partnerships and access to those economic, social, and also personal, psychological benefits of intimate relationships. And so here I'm going to give you an example that always makes me very uncomfortable, but the data supports it. As a result of mass incarceration and limited educational and employment opportunities, the pool, this is a quote from the book, the pool of eligible African-American men, those who are gainfully employed, that's how it's defined by sociologists, is significantly smaller than the number of African-American women who are seeking committed relationships. Now, some scholars, for example, Professor Rick Banks at Stanford Law School, have argued that given the smaller pool of eligible African-American men, that African-American women seeking male partners should simply date men of other races and should do what Latinas and Asian American women do, which is we have very high rates of, marrying out. However, Asian, Latino, and white men reject Asian American women at very high rates. And so in the book, I include, like all of the statistics. But for men, for white, Asian, and Latino men who say that they have a racial preference, 90% of them exclude African American women, explicitly exclude African American women. And so that means that African American women have fewer opportunities to meet partners with which to, enter into committed relationships and to raise children. Now, although certainly you don't need a partner in order to raise a child, the reality is that in our society in the U.S., where we do not have a sort of a social safety net for families, children who are raised in two-parent homes tend to have more resources, right? They just tend to have more financial resources and just more time resources than children who are raised by single-parent families. I mean, more people, more resources are better. So here we see how racial preferences perpetuate inequality in our society. Also, racial preferences cause psychic harm, not only to the people who who are excluded on the basis of race, right? Like the internet is full with so many stories of people who talk about the psychic harm of being rejected because of their race, but it also stigmatizes people who are not even on the market. And so here I'm drawing from some of the literature on housing discrimination and why lawmakers have found that housing discrimination is not only harmful to the individuals who are denied housing, but to the entire racial group because it stigmatizes everyone. Okay, so should the law intervene? And if so, how? Well, not every harm has a legal remedy, of course, but I believe that because the law played such a huge role in perpetuating racial inequality and creating racial inequality in the intimate sphere, that the law should actually remove some of the structural barriers to interracial intimacy. And here I am taking sort of a very soft approach, meaning the law should abolish single family zoning. I mean, there are many reasons to abolish single family zoning, right? One is we have a housing shortage, but also if we eliminate single family zoning, it would allow for people of different backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, to be able to move into different neighborhoods. So that's one of sort of the benefits of abolishing single family zoning. We should abolish the Mrs. Murphy exception. And I mean, many scholars have talked about this and they have said, like, why is this here? Why would we make an exception, allow someone to discriminate when seeking a tenant? We should abolish the K through 12 public school assignment system that is used in most districts and which perpetuates educational segregation and which perpetuates the achievement gap. And some places like Connecticut have actually done great work in looking at, how do we abolish the K through 12 system and how do we get more diverse districts. And so one might be creating inter-district magnet schools and locating them in predominantly minority neighborhoods. So that would allow us to have more integrated schools. We could allow children to attend schools outside of their district. I mean, those schools often, tend to be like for African-American and Latino children who may want to attend those schools that have more resources. And so that's something that the law could do. In this time that affirmative action is no longer an option in the way that we have traditionally thought of affirmative action. We should support admissions policies that will allow colleges and universities to enroll a diverse student body, a racially diverse student body, for example, by recruiting students from high poverty schools and looking at what the students have achieved. I think that those types of practices are not inconsistent with the Supreme Court's decision in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. And we can invest in public transportation in order to reduce spatial segregation. And there are also many reasons, obviously, from an environmental perspective, why we should be investing in public transportation. In addition, although the law did not create discrimination on dating platforms, I think that the law has allowed dating platforms to facilitate racial discrimination that is clearly prohibited in brick and mortar spaces, right? So think about the race and ethnic filters on some of these dating apps that some of these dating apps still have. For example, in the real world, a restaurant or a gym that is open to the public, they can't deny someone access or hide them in the back room because other people don't want to see them. But that's exactly what we do with the race filters on dating apps. They allow users to basically say, I don't want to see people of this race at all. Now, I'm not suggesting that people should not be able to exclude whoever they want for whatever reason they want, but there is a difference between having to look at an individual and then deciding not interested versus categorically excluding an entire group of people. So just very briefly, two writing challenges, two challenges that I encountered when I took on this project. One is the limitations of the data. And so sociologists quite often lump different, like members of different groups together. And so, for example, Southeast Asians and East Asians are sort of lumped as Asians, or for Latinos, Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans and, Cubans might be lumped together when the groups may have very different histories, very different socioeconomic backgrounds, different educational backgrounds. And so their racial preferences might be very different. So that was a challenge. Second, the challenge, I mean, I hope that I've sort of given you enough information from which you can conclude that the law has shaped our racial preferences, but I'm sure there are many of you who are still skeptical about how past laws continue to have an effect even today. Let me just see. I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I want to see if there's anything else that I want to talk about. My goals. So what are my goals for this book? So what I really wanted to do was to start a conversation. I wanted to start a conversation about the role of intimacy, in the role of law and intimacy and perpetuating inequality in our society. Because when we think about racial inequality, we often think about housing, we often think about education, but we don't think about how our intimate relationships, who we choose as a partner, and how those choices collectively may perpetuate inequality in our society. The other thing that I wanted to do is make sure that individuals who are engaging with my work take a step back and ask themselves, why did I choose my partner? Or why is it that I am attracted to these people and not these other people? Are these choices, did I make them independently, or were they affected by external forces that I would prefer not actually affect my decision making as to, who I want to spend, some of my time with, or maybe the rest of my life with. So I think I will end there because I've gone on for, I think, a little while, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, you can stay up there.
Okay. And by the way, I would just point out, the reason I kept looking down is I realized I can't see very well. I should have made this like 20-inch font.
Like, like this. I use like the biggest font you can use.
It's like, I can't see very well. My glasses are over there.
Oh.
So, okay.
Well, thank you for those fascinating remarks and for sharing your research with us. We have a lot to ponder. I'll have a few questions that were submitted ahead of time by students. And there were 4 students who have won a signed book. Well, you'll sign them. And there are some terrific questions. One of them I think you already answered, so I think I'll skip that one. But let me start with a question from Kumiko Dabney. Is Kumiko here? Okay. She's a class of 2025. And she asks, since so many people date and create social circles within their own profession, do you think this also influences the low number of interracial relationships, especially in highly prestigious professions such as lawyers and doctors, because there's not ample diversity within those programs?
And the answer to that, I think, is absolutely, right? And so even if you are someone who is thinking, I don't really care about the race of my partner. I'm just interested in meeting my soulmate. But the reality is that in the US, and I think throughout the rest of the world, we engage in what's known as assortative mating, right? We tend to date and marry people with similar economic background, socioeconomic, similar, from similar families, similar education. And if our schools are segregated, which means that access to good quality schools is going to be limited for African Americans and Latinos, and for Native Americans, as well, then it means that you're not going, but by the time you get to college, law school, and even higher up, there aren't going to be many people of color in those places. And so, of course, now you're going to see the people with access to resources will end up with people with access to resources. So, yes.
A question from Bridget Supernova. She is class of 2026. I know she's online. And she says, your book articulates a vision of social and legal reconstruction that feels almost utopian, and it is one I deeply share. Yet we live in a dystopic political and economic reality where those with power often have a vested interest in maintaining the hierarchies you describe. In practical terms, how can such an entrenched system be disrupted? What mechanisms, whether they're legal, institutional, or cultural, might realistically begin to dismantle the architecture of desire when the existing order depends on preserving?
Mhm. So thank you for that question. It actually reminds me of a question that Richard Rothstein, who I said wrote The Color of Law, he got a similar question at Seton Hall recently at orientation. And, for him, it was, in this time and age, in this time where it seems that that some individuals may have an interest in sort of maintaining the racial hierarchy, what do we do? What is the role for lawyers? And I think one of the things that that he said, and that I would say here is, we need to think, even though we're in a law school, we need to think beyond the law. And so Bridget's question mentions cultural, right? Something about culture.
Right.
And so I think, although in this book, because I'm focused on law, I don't talk about the importance of culture. But if we look at the rights of LGBTQ people, and how culture, shows like, I'm really dating myself, like Will and Grace in the 1990s, for example, really showed us that LGBTQ people are just as boring as the rest of us, right? And so that, I think, had an effect on how our society was willing to think about the rights of individuals that had been denied rights. I think that the same thing is important in the context of interracial relationships, right? And so if you watch any like British films or British shows, I think you're really surprised at the diversity of the actors, the racial diversity, and how people are in many different roles, so that you have African Americans in positions of power, and people of all different backgrounds and different roles. That is actually starting to happen in the US increasingly, right? And so now, a lot of times when I'm watching a show, I'm watching The Pit right now, and I'm like, wow, these doctors are just of so many different backgrounds. And it's just, like, I think we see people of different racial backgrounds playing different roles, as opposed to historically, I think what we saw is like this racial hierarchy of our society being reflected in media. That is changing. And I think as we see more of that, it may make us more open to considering people of different backgrounds when we are determining, well, who is an appropriate intimate partner. That's my hope.
Now a question from Rebecca Bogan is here. Yep, class of 2027. It's kind of two parts. Beyond systemic and structural barriers to change, what is the role of individual responsibility for addressing and combating inequality for aspiring lawyers in the field? Specifically, what steps do you think aspiring lawyers can take in law school and in practice to confront and reduce inequality related to gender and race and family?
Thank you. So I really believe in individual responsibility, right? I talked a lot about structural barriers to interracial intimacy, but I said one of the things that I'm hoping to accomplish is for each person to take a step back and ask themselves, like, why, as I said at the end of my remarks, what is influencing my my preferences? Who's in my circle of friends, and why? Is that because I automatically just have more in common with certain people? Maybe. But if so, why? And so that each individual should look at what they can do to expand their own circle of their network, right? Their personal network, their professional network, and make sure that that they're part of sort of an integrated society. Also, you're in law school, And even now, despite, I think some of the limitations that the federal government has been placing or suggesting that they can place on what is taught in law schools, I know that the vast majority of law schools are still offering courses on gender in the law. Most of us are still talking about inequality, racial, gender, identity, inequality in our traditional family law courses, in our torts classes, con law, of course. So pay attention, and make sure that that you question everything. One of the things that I've realized as when in a casebook, as a casebook author, is how often we almost sanitize the cases. We take out the racially offensive language or the the misogynist language because, well, it's just ugly. I believe that we need to see it. We need to make sure that it's there because we need to educate ourselves. So know your history. You can only change it if you actually know your history and educate others.
I think we have time for a possible audience question.
Perfect.
Anyone in the audience?
Okay. We're shy.
Well, the good news is that, oh, there's a question. Professor Lynch. No. Professor Lynch, please. You can go ahead.
Go ahead.
So I was thinking, first of all, you were all Ally's dad. This is just for all my.
Thank you.
So these.
Thank you.
About education, so. That's around. Right, and this whole like, how do we do it, how do we send children? It's level, we always have this myth that can be. You walk your child to school, and there's the myth of mommy and there's. But one thing I think that's challenging in a country like ours, so I'm thinking like from Albany, we see rural outcomes, we see places that are just not diverse by nature. And so some of the stuff that's working in metropolitan areas, maybe capital, but I think as a country, we're challenged by the vastness of geography. I don't know if you get into
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a really excellent point. Absolutely. I mean, there are going to be places where some of our states are just or some states are just like there's very little racial diversity, and then some parts of our states are just not very diverse. And so I'm not suggesting we take 5-year-olds and put them on a bus and commuting 2 hours. I mean, that's not realistic. Obviously not. What I am really thinking about, I guess, I mean, here I have to show sort of my bias. In New Jersey, we have all of these tiny municipalities that each have like their own school system. And it's like, why? You have 3 students there. And actually it's being challenged, right? There's litigation in New Jersey that is challenging our K through 12 public school assignment system because it perpetuates segregation and has resulted in African-American and Latino children attending schools that are 90% African-American and Latino and don't have the resources. So I don't have an answer for what do we do with, sort of areas that are not diverse, but I think we can start with the metropolitan areas. I mean, New York City, how can it be? I went to school in New York City and I did not know a white student until I went to high school. Because my school was all African-American and Latino. And so, I was born and raised in New York City. And so that's what I'm talking about. Thank you. There's one more.
Yes.
So you mentioned segregation in schools in regards to students being perpetuated by the community zoning. It seems to be a trend as well as in employment in schools, as like, for example, like the school with predominantly colored students predominantly also has colored staff members, and vice versa, like white schools with predominantly white staff. Could you shed some light on how that's still perpetuated in the employment side of schools?
Mhm. So I'm not sure if you're saying, and so if you have a school in a predominantly minority neighborhood, is that what you're saying? So the majority of the students in that school tend to be students of color. And so the teachers, the people who, the school, you can see why the school may make an effort to recruit teachers of color. I will tell you that there's some research that sometimes white teachers may not want to go to that school because because our society is so segregated, people are often, prefer to teach at a school that's closer to their neighborhood. And because because we are so segregated, you don't see that type of diversity. One of the things that I'm very concerned about is within, let's say, a school, that the people who are making the decisions, right? The teachers, the administrators tend to be of a particular race. And then the people who are, sort of cleaning the school or the assistants tend to be people of a different race. And what I'm arguing is that our educational system perpetuates that, right? Because of our segregated schools, we limit educational opportunities. And so that means that the same people who are almost at the bottom of our sort of socioeconomic way are also, it's very difficult to have the opportunities that will allow you to move up. So that's sort of what I'm focused on. Thank you.
So you mentioned that there are some barriers regarding online dating, is issues limiting by race, but I'd like if you could shed some light on the intersectionality between race and religion and how some religious specific websites, how do those perpetuate some of the issues that we've seen? How are they limiting?
Thank you. I always get a question about religion, and in the book I talk about that. And one of the things that I do is that I make a distinction between online dating sites that are basically helping people meet other people like them. For example, like JDate, right? For people who are Jewish who are hoping to meet other Jews. And that I think that's fine, because the first thing is, those sites, they're not excluding anyone, right? So my problem with the race filters is that you are categorically excluding a particular group. But so online dating sites that will help, for example, racial, ethnic, or religious minorities meet each other, or just people like, there's one that's like farmers want to meet other farmers, that's fine. And so with those, no one's excluding. And so that it's open to everyone. And so in that sense, I don't see, there's no violation of the law. One of the things that, when I talk about the book, I usually get some criticisms that my proposals are too soft.
Wow.
I'm not heavy-handed. And the reason I'm not heavy-handed, so for example, some people have said to me, we should not allow online sites like JDate or Latino Meet or something like that. And I really worry about having the law be very heavy-handed, because we saw what legal intervention in our intimate relationships, look at what it got us. So my view is that the law should get out of the way as much as possible, and let's try to remove the structural barriers that it created. But beyond that, let people figure things out. And maybe it's because I'm an optimist. I really believe that the vast majority of Americans, and there's data on this, that the vast majority of Americans, at least in theory, are committed to equality. And if people understood how their actions or learning how their actions may have effects that reproduce inequality, then at least some of us, you're here, that at least some of us would try to change our behavior at least a little bit.
I said Jacqueline. Oh, is that? No, that's not.
Writing research invites some perspective. I was wondering about what the general assumption of that. if you find that more really good?
So it's interesting because most of the people I talk to are law students and or lawyers, and they are really interested in that sort of introspection. And the reason actually that I sort of thought about that is I had presented a draft chapter at a law school, and it was a class on critical race theory. And I remember a student who actually asked me a question like, "What can I do to sort of undo the effects of racial preferences?" And so that this was many years ago when I was like first researching the book, and it led me to the conclusion that one of the things that I could suggest is that people do that. And so when I presented the book in other spaces, people have not been as receptive, but law schools, law students, very, very open. And so we're the ones who are charged with trying to change our society and making sure that we have a more equal society. So I think that's a good thing.
We'll take one more question. You can be the final question.
Any countries, different cities that shows that it benefits the benefits of this mix of commercial hierarchies about UK and media, but to share more about that and that's it.
So I actually don't talk about other countries. I mean, I want to make very clear that dismantling structural barriers and maybe having more interracial relationships. I'm not pushing interracial relationships. I just want the law to get out of the way. But that's not going to all of a sudden create this utopia where race doesn't matter. Racism is with us, and I don't think it's going away. And the example of that is Brazil, right? Brazil is incredibly diverse. There's so much racial mixture in Brazil, but Brazil is not utopia, right? There's still a lot of race discrimination there as well. But what we do see is, for example, in Britain, interracial relationships interracial marriage is much more common than it is in the United States. And so I don't know why, but this is where I go back to, I think maybe the fact that it is so common, everyone's doing it. It's not a big deal. Whereas here, it still is a big deal in some parts of the country. And even I teach in New Jersey, and there are students who tell me, I did not meet another student of color until I went to college. I'm like, you live in New Jersey, but they live in a suburb that is predominantly white. So thank you so much. I have really Great job. Thank you.
Let's finish closing. So that was just wonderful. So much food for thought. Thanks for your great questions. A great, fantastic discussion. I do want to announce exciting news that we already have secured our 12th Katz lecturer for 2026. It's someone that I'm sure you know, Dorothy Roberts, who is coming on Wednesday, November 4th, 2026. Yeah, yeah, Angel's like, wow. So yeah, you come for that. So, more details to follow, hold the date. But I'm guessing you now would like to go have some food and drink in the foyer. Professor Maldonado will be signing books at the reception. For those of you on Zoom, please treat yourself to a drink. But you unfortunately can't join us. But thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and we'll see you down at the foyer.